This is a Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 21. Hi there, and welcome to the Contemporary History of Iran, a series from Roqe Media. This is Part 21, Literary Roots of the Revolution. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Our aim with this series is to explore the events, personalities, and issues that have shaped modern Iran. We want to do this as much as possible through a non-traditional lens, through snapshots of change, and using alternative voices or angles. This series is mostly in English and will feature a new episode posted every Thursday across our Roqe Media platforms. We will post subtitled excerpts with Farsi Zirnavis on our YouTube and Instagram sites. We are coming to you on roqemedia.com. It is there that you can link to all of our platforms, and we invite you to check out parts 1 through 20 of this series that are already posted. To become a sponsor or patron of Roqe Media, please contact us through our website. The Contemporary History of Iran is brought to you in part by Yazdani Law Group. YLG is one of the largest Iranian-Canadian immigration law firms. Their mission, rooted in the leadership of founder Afshin Yazdani, is built on continuously striving to innovate and introduce new immigration pathways for their clients. Afshin began his career as a lawyer and law professor in Iran, and his company has now made it their goal to provide the best, simplest, least risky, and most inexpensive way to immigrate to Canada. YLG has an impressive track record, hundreds of applications from Iran successfully processed every year. They are at YLGPC on Instagram. That is Yazdani Law Group. All right, let's get started. Here now is the Contemporary History of Iran, Part 21. We often hear about the intellectual class that supported the revolution of 1979 in Iran. We also then hear about the heartbreak of those same intellectuals that followed when the revolution was co-opted by clergy formalists and dreams of a new democratic and open Iran were destroyed. And many of those intellectuals were executed, imprisoned, or sent into exile. But given Iran's celebrated history of literature and poetry, what role did Iranian writers and how they were treated and dealt with under Pahlavi rule play in bringing on a revolution in Iran? Indeed, how important was Persian literature in creating political sea change? And what were the lessons for those who fought repression and censorship under the monarchy when they faced an even worse plight under Khomeini? Our guest for this episode is a well-known literary figure and an acclaimed voice in the world of Persian language, literature, and culture. Dr. Ahmad Karimi-Hakkak is a professor of Persian at the UCLA Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures and the founding director of the Center for Persian Studies at the University of Maryland. Dr. Karimi-Hakkak was born in Mashhad, obtained his BA in English Literature from Tehran University, and his master's and PhD in Comparative Literature at Rutgers University in the States. He is the author, editor, and translator of numerous books and more than 100 research articles and essays. In recognition of his outstanding contributions to Iranology, he was the recipient of the most prestigious honor in that field, the Yarshater Lectureship, in 2003. His latest book is entitled A Fire of Lilies, Perspectives on Literature and Politics in Modern Iran. And right now, Dr. Ahmad Karimi-Hakkak joins me from Los Angeles, California today. Hello, sir.
Hello, how are you, Jian? It's good to talk to you.
It is such an honor to speak with you. Thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
I want to ask you about a lot of what you explore in this compelling book of yours, A Fire of Lilies. And if you'll allow for a bit of a spoiler alert as an initial question to set the stage or the context for our conversation by getting right to the overall theme, part of your book examines the role of poets, writers, literature in supporting change and the revolution of 1979, and then reversing that support by the early years of the Islamic Republic when realizing that what had been created was not quite what they had hoped. You synthesized this speaking of your own experience in the prologue. You recount getting interrogated in 1983 by a representative of the Khomeini regime, and you say, let me quote you, "I recall the chief interrogator most vividly as he pointed to the files in front of him and asked me why I, an opponent of the monarchical state, had now turned into such a counter-revolutionary academic, such an ardent opponent of the Islamic Republic. My response was uncompromising. The reasons are the same." Dr. Karimi-Hakkak, can you explain the meaning of that passage and what you mean when you say the same?
Well, the same means I think and I am convinced that the monarchical Iran after 1953, that is the coup d'etat, for the last 25 years of the Shah's rule, was not any better than anything we see today. It may appear that way because in envisioning possible futures, we rely on the best of scenarios, whereas someone like me, being 25, 26 years old at the time, I started looking at the concrete experiences I was going through. The fact is that the Savak was a very, very vicious secret police organization. It was not what it seemed to be. The Savak was a horrible predecessor to what's only more horrible now, and that is Savama. That is become a ministry in itself. So, in imagining all the possible futures, you do not rely so much on your wishes, but you look at your own experience. So when I'm 25, 26 years old, and I'm thinking that Siyahkal has happened, that is 5 or 6 revolutionaries in Gilan have disarmed the gendarmes in the gendarmerie, and for that 14 people get killed, get executed. That's not. It doesn't take your ideas to who's Khomeini. It takes ideas to what happened last week, and what it is that you're reading in the newspaper today. So what I'm saying is, we all wish that we could imagine futures that would be better, but barring the ability to do that, you do that for yourself. You just think it cannot get worse than this. And I, for one, thought that oftentimes, almost every night as I was going to bed, I was thinking, it's really bad. Anything that happens is not going to be worse than this.
Right.
And it did turn out to be much worse than what it was.
I was going to say, as you know, sitting there in L.A., there are people, you've already lost some folks listening who will say, how can you possibly compare the pre-revolution, the Pahlavi years, no matter what you want to say, to afterward. But that is part of the theme of the book, because you are a representative of writers and poets and the literature, the literary tradition in Iran that enabled a revolution that turned into something that was not intended. And that's what I want to get to with this interview. And I'm so glad to get the opportunity to do this. A little more context just of you and the role of literature, because there's some sweet moments in learning about you. You're not just an observer and teacher of Persian literature and socio-political and cultural trends. You're a writer, of course, yourself, and a lifelong fan of Persian literature. You were a little boy, as I understand it, who became captivated by Persian poetry based on your father reciting poems to you. Tell us about that time.
Oh my God, those were the days. Yeah, he had a lot of poems memorized, and I learned it from him, but I did not learn the system of Persian poetry. For that, I had to go to various libraries and go through stages of education, and only at Tehran University I realized that Iran, my country, has always had horrible political systems and wonderful and getting more and more wonderful cultural systems. So the distinction really educated me into not mixing politics with literature. In fact, even the best of literature in the whole world does not guarantee democracy. These are of course sacred things, but each one would have to happen separately. As such, you know, in a country like Iran, we have always had horrible rulers, but we have had wonderful poets, which is what makes this country, this poetry, so beautiful. But reading beautiful poems of beautiful poets like Saadi and Hafiz, or what you were reciting, I was watching you last night, and you know, شیشه غم را بزن گر نزنی بر سنگ
Yeah.
هفت رنگش می شود هفتاد رنگ
I
etc
think
etc.
reciting badly is what you want to say, but yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I refuse to think that out of this culture must have come very democratic people. The very poet who said this may have been a die-hard Muslim. And so it's amazing. Iran is one of those cultures where the farther away you get from the political history, the more it's possible for you to become proud of your own culture. There's nothing that you take pride in when you look at Khomeini and Khamenei or the Shah of Iran. But for the same reason, you come to see as leaders of the culture, in the cultural field, those wonderful poets that have left us wonderful wisdom.
But speaking to your book, and in a general sense, first, I mean, we'll get into the specifics. How transformative can that literature be? How much change can that poetry, those poets, bring about? In the introduction to your book, Asghar Sayed Ghohrab says, if Persian culture is the body of Persian-speaking peoples, poetry is the soul, the stamina, and the aura.
Right.
Now, I love that statement, but we know that poetry was inextricably tied to the Persian culture, back to the book of King, the Shahnameh. But beyond romantic ideals and ideas and the way we walk around with pride, talking about the place of poetry and literature in Iranian history, how and why do you believe poetry or writers have played a significant role in transforming events in contemporary Iran?
I don't think they had much of a presence in the practical field. I don't think a good poem makes you a better person. It can give you the capacity to become a better person, but it does not there's no guarantee. In fact, some of those poems may encourage you to become as ruthless as possible, to annihilate your enemies. So in a way, I think what the image that Asghar Sayed Ghohrab uses there, and you just cited, is wonderful, it's beautiful, but it's not really all beautiful bodies have beautiful souls or give rise to beautiful souls. If someone can have a beautiful body but a horrible soul, or the opposite. As such, again, we have to think of these as separate fields. It's telling, Jian, that I first titled my book Awkward Encounters. And every one of the chapters in this book cites at least one such awkward encounter. It was Asghar Sayed Ghohrab who suggested, Fire of Lilies, and the phrase has been used in a poem by Shamlu, Sukhtbar Susanha, and I thought it was a beautiful image, but it's an image of someone who can destroy lilies to make fire, and not out of need. So in a way, since 1953 and on, almost all Iranian poets have been, all those who have really we call committed poets, have had become desirous of better times.
Right.
And it's that desire that gave rise to an imaginary situation that we all imagined before the revolution. And it's not like everybody fell in line after the revolution. In fact, there was a lot of resistance. A lot of us, myself included, were saying, look, this all of this is just, the little khas o khashak, unwelcome things that the water of the revolution is taking with it. But it turned out to be the real soul of the revolution.
But let
So
me get to that idea of imagination in just a
go
moment.
ahead.
I just want to stick with a general question about poets and writers,
Sure.
which is that do you think, I mean, given the nature of the Iranian polity and given the nature of the exalted place that literature and poets have or have had sort of culturally, I mean, is there this sense, say this through the 20th century, where the poet or the writer feels that they have to be an agent of change? If I quote Sayed Ghorab again in your intro, he says, in a country with a tumultuous political culture in which poetry functions as an icon of identity, it is not
Yeah.
surprising that poetry and literature in general is still a chief medium for commenting on socio-political events. Is that to say, do you think that writers in Iran have had little choice but to be political and be the voice of opposition in a political culture that has generally been characterized by repression?
No, definitely it's true. But after all, everybody, including the poets, act on objective experiences, not subjective imaginaries. So I grew up being raised in a family that cherished freedom and cherished serving the country and cherished becoming someone of influence because they thought I was capable of that. And yet, I see myself doing that and not doing it. Doing it in terms of, yeah, sure, some Iranian American students may take my classes and benefit from them. Some of my American friends might understand Iran better and Iranian history and Iranian culture better, but there's no guarantee. Again, it's like the imaginary versus the objective experience day in and day out, Jian. That I think that's where our poets failed us in a way and failed themselves because they gave rise to a wish in us all and they wished it with us, and their poems created the desire in us, and yet the desire was so badly led awry
Okay,
in a
let me
way.
ask you specifically about that,
Sure.
because it's the sort of the $1 million question, and I love, I'm so interested in the way you phrase it in your book. You've said the revolutionary movement that culminates in 1978, 1979 in Iran was itself, and I'm quoting you, in a profound sense, a work of the imagination.
Yeah.
You've just said that now too. It's hard to explain that. Tell us what you mean by the revolution or the revolutionary movement being a work of the imagination.
Yeah. Well, my first book in English came out in 1978. This is some years after the revolution.
Sorry,
And what?
you mean 88?
No, 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 no. I
1978
mean,
isn't after the revolution.
no, no. 19. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm
Uh,
sorry. No, yeah, before the revolution, 1978.
okay,
Yes,
yes, thank you.
yes. And in fact, at that time, Americans didn't know much about Iran, and they were wondering because many Americans thought that the Shah of Iran was on the Takht Tavus, on the Tavus throne and Peacock throne, and everything was fine in Iran. But then there was people were asking themselves, Americans were, my friends were, uh, asking themselves why it is that the Shah, why that we didn't know that the Shah was so deeply hated. And the reviewer of this book had said, well, if we didn't know, if the CIA did not know that the Shah of Iran was deeply hated by his own people, maybe we should have some people who understand poetry, Persian poetry. So it was the poetry of the time, and this is the years immediately before the revolution, that gave rise to that kind of, when people used images of kids going to school, but instead of books in their backpacks, they were carrying bombs. So it's that kind of a thing where nothing was in place in monarchical Iran. That's why a lot of people idealize the monarchical regime. And of course, I would have liked to live in that environment rather than the environment at the present, but we didn't know any better. It had given rise to us that the next revolution will take us to the wonderful world where we would have freedom, and that's just around the corner.
But the words "work of the imagination" makes me think
Yeah,
it's fantasy. It's not practical. It's something that you're
sure,
conjuring
sure.
up that you is not based on actually what's happening on the ground.
You're right. You're right. I prefer the word fantasy. You're right. It was not true imagination. It was you were fantasizing some ideal state, which did not never showed up. But that does not mean that the monarchy that monarchical Iran was the favorite state. In fact, the culture has always had this imbalance between politics and literature,
Yes.
and a lot of poets, including Saadi and Hafiz and Molavi and everyone else, were faced in these horrible systems and wrote that beautiful poetry because it came out of their wishes. The difference is we thought it was right around the corner. All we have to do is get rid of the Shah, and of course everything will be fine.
Well,
And
and
it
the,
didn't
the
turn out that.
criticisms of the Shah were more practical, were less imaginary. I mean, you make the case that it was poets and writers that really articulated the case that, as you put it, that the monarchical
Sure.
state was fundamentally at odds with the interests of the common people in Iran in the Pahlavi years. This is after the 1953 coup. Do
Yes.
you believe writers and poets were again, this is the $64 million question, but do you believe the writers and poets were reflecting the sentiment of people? I mean, not in 1979, because by that time it's hard to tell. Everybody's on the side of the revolution or whatever. But in say back to the late 50s or into the 60s or even the 70s, do you believe the writers and poets were reflecting the sentiment of the people, or that writers and poets were fermenting and creating that sentiment?
Well, both can be done. Both can be done, really. And I had something of each one of them. At the end of my acknowledgement, I say, as a small token of my appreciation and sympathy, I would like to dedicate this work to all those who played a part in the making of the Iranian Revolution, only to suffer its consequences. You see, you have to distinguish between the imagining a new system, imagining the fall of monarchy, and imagining a system that's not as bad, and then seeing a system that's very bad, suffering its consequences, I call it. So I was one, when I was growing up, my dad and mom did not train me to become to live in America and to serve Americans in understanding Persian anything better than they did. But they wanted me to serve my own society. به جامعه خدمت باید بکنی, and so on and so forth. And these words I heard day and night, that I was being raised in order to offer service to my country.
Right.
But I became deprived of that, and the country became worse.
But if it's a fantasy, how aren't you surely open to the criticism of somebody going, dude, you and your poet friends sold us a bill of goods based on your imaginations, and we all went and created a revolution that got us into a worse place.
Sure, and then and their dads and moms came along with us. You see, it's not like it's a generational thing. It's not like there were people who were for the Shah and there were people who were against the Shah. The Shah was deeply despised. And that's the fact, regardless of what the revolution did to us.
Well, let me ask you about that, because by the 60s and definitely the 70s, literary works, as you point out in your book, in Iran, begin to paint the picture of the monarchy as this collision between the people and the political power structure. And this is this is a quote I'm quoting from your book: "As the person of the monarch," this would be the Shah, "succeeded in bringing under his personal authority the various institutions of the state and government, his image was ingrained in literature as an evil presence alien to popular ideals." The idea of an evil presence is quite dramatic. Is that a symbolic notion, or do you believe the Shah was really seen that way?
Well, he seemed that way, but I realized that it was something that we fantasized. But the point is, Iran was the first Middle Eastern country in which there was a constitution, 1905. And the Shah, after his father left Iran after World War II, at the start of World War II,
Yeah.
he swore to be serving and defending the constitution of Iran. And every step of the way he violated it. That's why there's this joke that a lot of Iranians tell each other. They say Reza Shah, that's his father, the first Pahlavi, was a prime minister who wanted to become a king, and he did become a king. Muhammad Reza, his son, was a king who wanted to become a prime minister, and he did succeed. Whereas the Shah, it was a symbol of the country's unity, bound by a constitution that he had to observe, that he had sworn to observe. But at every step of the way, he left reigning and he became a ruler. He became a ruler. So we kept, that was our favorite thing. شاه دیگه سلطنت نمیکنه، حکومت میکنه. He's not a symbol of the country's unity, but he's actually driving the country the way he wants to, and not anyone else wants to. You see, a good leader is someone who walks ahead of the people, but does not lose sight of their wishes. He lost sight of Iranians' wishes for at least 10 years.
And give us some details. Give us some
Sure.
the facts in terms of how this, in particular, affected your field, your colleagues. I mean, how can you characterize the nature of censorship and the crackdown on literary expression in the 60s and 70s under Pahlavi rule? Give us some idea of that.
Yeah. First of all, literature aside, the Shah, after the Siyah event, really left the Savak loose, unchained them, so that they could do anything they wanted. That's where the question of shekanje or torture came to Iran. The last 7 years of the Iranian monarchy was a horrible time. Remember those celebrations? Well, it was nonsense. Anwar Sadat, who at that time was no friend of the Shah's, said it best. He said, on behalf of the 6,000-year-old nation of Egypt, I would like to congratulate His Imperial Majesty on the 25th centenary of the Persian Empire. You see, it was, in other words, it was something where he spent $12 billion in order to wine and dine all the movers and shakers of the world, including Spiro T. Agnew, the vice president at the time of the United States of America.
But Dr. Karimi-Hakkak, we have had just as many people come on this program saying, sure, the role of Savak has been over exaggerated, and the stats show they didn't actually kill that many people, and this is revisionist history. I mean, I'm not sure how to react to when folks say these things, but it's so we kind of you have these different sides fighting over what the history was, sure, and trying to figure out where the truth lies, right?
The thing is, first of all, I don't mind people saying that, because it's true. Savama today is much worse than Savak was. But at that time, we didn't have the Savama. This comparison itself is a false pretense. Right. It's like, why should we compare? Why should we compare something that's the worst in the world now in the 21st century with something that was bad, really, really bad? This comparison is out of place, because you're looking for reasons, for causes of things, and not for consequences at that time. You're talking about if there is a past, you have to compare the Shah at 22 when he became a Shah, and he swore to the constitution, and with the Shah in 1355 or or a few years before the revolution. There's no reason. Otherwise, you would have to say people were just stupid. And I refuse to think that. Logically, I don't think people.
I got you.
But
if writers and the literary class were reacting to not just the political culture of the time, but in particular to censorship and the crackdown on expression, tell me, like, what wasn't allowed? How bad was the censorship? What was the plight of the writer by the late 1960s in Iran that would lead to such a movement of intellectuals feeling so displaced?
Yeah. Well, If we set aside the issue that being in prison is much worse today than it was 50 years ago,
Okay.
putting people in prison is bad. It's
Yes.
just bad on the
Yes.
face of it. Someone is in prison because he wrote the wrong poem. He praised the wrong person, okay? Or he didn't praise the Shah. And he's put in prison, or she is put in prison. Do you say, but if a revolution happens, it's going to be
No,
worse?
I'm not saying that at all anymore.
No, I know, I know
saying
you're not.
I'm saying what would they put in prison for? I want to know what the level of censorship was.
For writing, a lot of writers were in prison. In fact, I remember this is 1976, 77. I was in this country before the revolution, in New York, in front of the building of the United Nations, holding pictures of all writers, Iranian writers who were in prison. And Arthur Miller joined us, and Kurt Vonnegut joined us, and many others joined us to ask for freedom for these people. And the current generation of writers had not been born.
Right.
So at that time, we were not comparing. We were not saying, but if the revolution happens and if the Islamists take over, it will become worse. In fact, we were
Right.
sure
Right.
that it would not go to the revolution would not go to the Islamic people.
The Writers Association of Iran,
Yes,
Kanun Nevesendegane Iran,
right.
gets founded in 1968. You believe this is a pivotal event, and even though the Writers Association ends up losing this historical
Yeah.
fight against censorship, it plays a major role in the course of the Iranian Revolution. Tell us about the founding of that association and why you think it's so important.
Well, yeah. Here's what I think about it. Uh, what the revolution becomes is a mirror that in which everyone can look and see an image of their own desires. So if we distinguish three kinds of Iranians before the revolution, in the 10, 15 years before the Iranian revolution, first you had the Islamists, and they were there. And they were there. And Iran is a Muslim country, and that's it. They had the right to be there. They were Iranian as I am, as every secular person is. And then there was those remnants of the Mossadegh era, who were longing for liberalism of that sort, of 30 years before that, of the time before the coup, and so on and so forth. And then there were the leftists who had just become a younger generation. They had broken away from the Tudeh party of Iran, that was the old communist party that towed the lines of the Soviet Union. And these three people, each one looking in the mirror of the revolution, saw the image of their own desires fulfilled. Only the Islamists, of course, succeeded. And I'm not sure a good Muslim is having fun today in Iran either, because this is not even Islamic. There's nothing Islamic about the regime in Iran today. No one should think that I'm in support of what happened. As I say in my acknowledgement, I say I suffered the consequences.
Yes.
I was purged. I'm sitting in a room with my books in front of me, and I have two things in frames, and I look at them every time, and those are the documents that caused the revolution 2 years into the revolution to purge me from Tehran
Yes.
University.
Yes. Yeah.
And I left the United States in the early months of the revolution, in Bahar Azadi, in the springtime of freedom. And at that time, I didn't even think that it was going to be worse. I
But
was
then
sure.
let me get to that, if you will, because I
Sure.
want to, but I'm still at the part of how we're leading up to that, and I want to know: was the Writers Association, was it specifically formed in reaction to censorship? Was its main
Yes.
intent to try and fight this censorship that
Yeah.
was happening?
Yes. And it was disbanded as a result.
Yes.
It was in 1347. That's 1968, 69. That a group of writers went to see Hoveyda, who was the prime minister at the time, and they asked him to please uh, do something so that the Ershad of the day, that is Bezarat Farhang, should not censor everything that was written. And he said, well, why don't you select some people from among yourselves to watch? And Al Ahmad gave a very good answer. He said, we are not here to define censorship for you. We are here to ask you to disband it. And what happened was the Writers Association of Iran was disbanded as a result. Because, again, it was the last 10 years of the Shah. Siyakal had happened, and the Shah left the clerical leaders free. Not free, really. Khomeini was arrested and exiled to Turkey. But the left and the middle, that is the liberals, got it a lot worse in the last 10 years of pre-revolutionary times.
Yeah, that seems pretty accepted generally, that it was the latitude that was given to the clergy that ends up coming, biting you in the back in the end. How did, there's something interesting you talk about when we're talking about censorship, imprisonment, the regulation of expression of writers, that's all intensifying under Pahlavi rule by the mid-1970s. You juxtapose that and talk about what was also happening on a parallel course, the glorification of Iran's pre-Islamic past. How was that being used when it came to censorship?
Yeah. Well, Iranians are Muslims. And anyone who kind of gives primacy to ancient Iran is acting illiberally. That is against the idea of the people, because the Shah said after he had been dethroned and he was in Panama or somewhere where he said, and I'm a Muslim, and he's right, he was a Muslim. He was a Muslim. He didn't. The question was not whether it's Muhammad or Cyrus the Great. The question is what political system, whether politics should be a separate field than religion, and people can choose. Yes, of course, everybody was freer at the time than they are now. But is that the kind of metrics by which we come to the truth of things? No. We didn't know what's happening, what's present today was way into the future at that time. And we didn't know what shape it would take. But nobody wanted the clerical leaders to form a government. Everybody thought, and Khomeini said it himself in Nofle-le-Chateau in France. He said, I'm just a cleric. I'll go to Qom and live my life there.
Yes.
And he violated that, and he violated every other thing that he had said. So no one should think, whatever they think of me or you think of me, no one should think that I am for the present regime. I think, yes, given the present regime and the present experience, I would much rather go back to the Shah's time, even though there was torture.
I don't believe you're for the present regime, because I've read your book and you make it very clear that you're not.
Now I would, but at that time, I'm writing this book as a participant observer, and I'm saying when I was 26, 27, and I was not 78 like I am now, at that time, all I had was the deterioration of the political system, so much so that the democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh had died and had been put aside, and the Shah, who had sworn he would actually observe the Constitution, was acting against the Constitution, because he was, after all, he was forming parties, political parties. Imagine the Shah of Iran forming political parties. And this is a constitutional monarch. And at that time, the government of Nixon was giving the Savak everything they wanted, and the Shah all the weapons that he asked for, because the Shah had the oil money and everything, and he was rolling in petrodollars.
Tell me a bit about, as a writer and as somebody who is the colleague to many of these writers who say we're involved in the Writers Association, tell me about the culture of self-censorship that would take place in a deeply censored polity. You talk about this in one of your chapters, and how censorship led to self-censorship. Figures like Saadi and Bahram Bezai were decrying this in 1977.
Sure.
Tell me
Absolutely.
about that.
Well, look, you become conscious when you already know at the time of writing that your writing will be read by someone from a very specific point of view. You try to avoid those, because the idea is to have people read your words, not to have them destroyed and pulped, turned into pulp. No writer wants to just destroy afterwards. People write because other people can read, and they want to know their opinions. And when I think that At some stage, some people who may not even understand the Persian language as much as I do are going to look over my thing and decide which
Yeah.
is allowable and which is not. Then I self-censor. Self-censorship is a result of censorship. There's no such thing as no censorship. There's no such censorship as total censorship. There's always a give and take. And I'm saying the Shah's regime was not good, but the Shah's regime did not desire the situation where nobody would write in Iran. They wanted writers. They wanted writers to write what would, to them, be sanctionable,
Yeah.
and they did not. And they wrote everything that they believed
Strangely
themselves.
resonant with what musicians or filmmakers will talk about in
Absolutely.
Iran today, where we had Bahman Farmanara on the show talking about the lengths he goes to try and put, the allegorical scenes in his film that won't get, the film censored, but allow him to still put it out. But he's really jumping through hoops to try and, satisfy censors rather than focusing on his own creativity.
Well, I respect Mr. Farmanara very much, and I think the mention of allegory not only highlights his own work, but also speaks of the kind of censorship that you become conscious of. And therefore, what you put in the mouth of a fox and a dog and a cat or a mouse or whoever,
Yeah.
that which you cannot say expressly. In fact, in the end, if literary culture was the only kind of culture you cared for, it's not. But if it were, you would want to have censorship because it would elevate you to allegorizing something that could not be said the way it was in a real way. So it's not to say some against literature or for literature when we say self-censorship is destructive in the sense that the writer finds it necessary to do, not that he desires to do it, not that he takes pleasure in doing it.
Dr. Karimi-Hakkak, in the lead up to the revolution, there's a pivotal event, Shab, the 10 Nights,
Oh, yes.
held in Tehran's Goethe Institute. This is in October of 1977, in which you write, this event, these 10 Nights, are beyond question the most significant group event in Iranian intellectual history. For those who've never heard of this or don't remember it, tell us about it.
Well, there's a reason. There's a good reason why people have not heard about it, because it was such an important thing. But the way the revolution went, neither the secular intellectuals nor the clerical leaders wanted to claim it. So it became an orphan. The 10 Nights became an orphan of the culture. But that was exactly the focal point. Remember I spoke about the mirror? That's the time when the right, the left, the center, and everyone else began to see the image of their own ideals in one event. And that was the Shab event in October 1955. So in a way, it was a very important event. Unfortunately, everyone is ignoring it. The revolutionists wanted to have their own progeny of the revolution, their own history, and so on and so forth. The seculars, of course, wanted to wish that they, some of the people that you just named would not be there, and it was an event where everyone. It was the most democratic Iran became, and that was within the last 2 years because the Shah had declared an open political space, and this was part of that dahshat. And when the revolution happened, one of the first things to be discarded was the dahshat event, because it had not only the revolutionists but others as well, and those others are not good, of course, to the revolutionists, to the clerical leaders.
I want to read a passage from your book when you're talking about writers and the support for the revolution by the late 1970s. And you write, many Iranian writers saw in the idea of revolution a unifying cause, a historic opportunity, and above all, the possibility of their vision's fulfillment. While the exact shape of the world that might replace the existing one eluded them, something you've said in this interview as well, the revolutionary situation still appeared replete with limitless possibilities. The spectacle spectacle that was marching before their eyes constituted a radically new type of phenomenon that demanded to be recognized and recorded as the realization of a long-awaited intellectual fantasy. It's almost a giddy sentiment, but I believe that sentiment existed because of the knowledge of knowing that many intellectuals in the West go back to Iran in that moment thinking this is going to be some kind of dream scenario, right?
Exactly, precisely. Look, the revolution became much more than a revolution. It was just the turn that you had to take to get to freedom. No one makes a revolution just to have a revolution. A revolution has a meaning and a content. And the content of the revolution accommodates everybody's desire. So that Khomeini saw in the revolution probably something close to what we have today, but someone like me was seeing a much freer Iran, in which monarchy is no longer there, which is let's say probably in all likelihood a republic, and people get elected, and some years later they may not be elected. In other words, people choose who rules them. The rulers are ruled by the ruled, or ruled over by the ruled. In other words, the common man, the common woman, the common everybody, all the citizens come together to agree to vote, and then agree that the majority rules, but not violates the rights of the minority.
But on the flip side, just let me push back in the. I mean,
Sure.
Inevitably, you sort of have to do the gut check and go, why were writers so blind to the possibility of how the revolution might turn out, or intellectuals in general? It's funny because what's that quote? It's Maya Angelou or somebody who says, if you want to know who someone is, listen to what what they have to say about themselves, and the dangers of the co-optation by the Islamic formalists are there. You can see them certainly now in retrospect. In his famous May 1978 interview with Le Monde that you'll remember, Khomeini refers to Iranian intellectuals and writers as agents of the Shah and lackeys of the superpowers. Why was something like that not a warning sign that, hey, this guy is not your messiah?
Because there were intellectuals of both sorts, of all sorts. There were really intellectuals who served monarchy. But there were also intellectuals, mostly the poets and the writers, fiction writers and such, who wanted a better society. So in a way, it's not like all intellectuals think alike and all the laity thinks alike. No. In every group of people, in every layer of the society, you have people of different sorts. That's why democracy is, Churchill said it, I think, democracy is the worst system in the world, worst political system, except for every other system.
Yeah, but are you really saying that an Iranian intellectual at the time would be sitting listening to Khomeini say this and go, okay, but he's not talking about my kind of intellectual. He's talking about the other intellectuals who are agents of the Shah? I mean, it's a bit, it's a little bit of a slippery slope, isn't it?
No, well, the Shah has his own poets. The Shah has his own fiction writers. But they were not; those were not the people that someone like me would read. Someone like me would read people like Shamlu and Akhavan and Furukh Farrukhzad and so on and so forth. People who would not serve the people in power, who would reflect my kind of ideals. So we have. I'm sure that there are many 78-year-olds right now like me who have different opinions, and that's fine. The point is not whether I'm right and they're wrong. The point is, how can we accommodate everybody in a system? And in America, in Canada, in other countries, they've figured this out, or at least they've come closest to figuring it out. In countries like Iran, they have not.
There's a lot of people in Canada and U.S. would say we haven't figured it out here either. But
that's part of the privilege.
Yeah, in the immediate aftermath of the revolution,
Yeah.
So this is that moment of catharsis. Oh, the king is dead. We've kind of got rid of the bad guy. There's no more censorship. You say Iranian literature almost seems celebratory, and poetry becomes at once perceptively more kinetic and more buoyant.
Yeah.
How long does that last? When are the warning signs that, as you experienced in your own personal life, that this isn't the
Yeah.
celebratory thing that we thought?
Unfortunately, it did not last long. And I myself, in the first year of the revolution, I saw myself differing from those who were ruling the country. But I didn't think that I was useless. I and hundreds of thousands of other people thought that way and went to Iran in order to change it, to prevent it, because we thought the revolutionary stream is bringing all kinds of things. Of course, water and beautiful water, but at the same time, a lot of other things, a lot of, unwanted things. So the revolution went stage by stage. In 1979, the revolution happened. This was late in the American year. It was in early in February, but in late in Iranian calendar, and as such, it took someone like Khomeini 3-4 years to actually make the system, make the institutions that he wanted. It was in 1983 that the first real set of laws were put in place with the aim and purpose of excluding certain ideas. For example, let's say the communists or the liberals, and so on and so forth. And that became worse and worse as time went by. So when a poet says, I do not believe that any force can build tomorrow out of the stuff of yesterday's, this was our belief. But it was proven that we were wrong.
Do you remember when you knew that this was not turning out as you had hoped? I mean, notwithstanding the interrogator, this is a couple of years later, but before that, do you remember a moment in 80 or 81 or something where you go, oh boy, this
Yes,
is...
I remember time and again that I would find myself in debate with people who would say, just wait, things will get better. And I was saying, when? It's already 3 years. It's already 4 years. And when it became 4 years, I left the country. And when I was educated in the West, in America, and therefore I knew I could get some job, and I did. But a lot of people lost their lives. But because they were wrong, they did not deserve. I'm not saying they deserved what they got. But unfortunately, it became a combination of what we saw and what we imagined what we were seeing. Some people tolerated more things than I had been able to. In fact, early on in the first year, I said, is Khomeini really the leader of this revolution? Can he manage? He's not saying the kinds of things he said in Paris,
Right.
in France. He's saying other things. So it happened day by day by eventful day, things changed. And we became, and ultimately, I knew it was not going to be the kind of country I would want to spend my life in. And I came out. I traveled to America.
How did the Writers Association of Iran come to a sad end by 1981 after the revolution?
Oh, it's unfortunate. Yes. Well, early in the revolution, there were people that we called Shah, people who were really just roam the streets and follow women and say "Ya ru sari, ya tu sari," which is horrible. Which is horrible. But the government, or at least the government of Bazargan, said they are not one of us. And Bazargan said distinctly, and he was a Muslim follower of Mossadegh, and he said, the Ayatollah Khomeini wants Iran for Islam. I want Islam for Iran. I wish Bazargan had won. And after that, Bani Sadr lost. And after that, Montazeri lost. And there were time and again, people rose up in order to correct what was going wrong, and they failed. And now it's 43 years later we're talking about.
It is such an education and It's very energizing talking to you and
Thank you.
hearing your perspectives. I'll just keep you for a moment more to ask a couple of final sort of general questions. And these are never easy questions to answer because they're sort of broad, reflective ones. But, by the early 80s, as you've just mentioned, writers are executed, imprisoned, or fleeing into exile. Censorship becomes not only the norm again, but so much so it does in a new and terrifying way. How do you see the censorship and crackdown on writers after the revolution on the continuum of Iranian history in the modern era?
Well, one of the chapters in the book is on that. The functionaries of the new regime thought immediately, oh, these poets used to talk about night being bad and sahar or morning would be good, and they would start censoring people, calling people in to talk about their works, and they said, why are you saying we still need to go a ways to get to what we want? No, people have achieved what they want. This is what they wanted. In other words, they were trying to sell the Islamic Republic as the ideal for everybody, not for some.
Sure.
I'm sure some people were sincere enough to want what something of Islam. Some they do not believe or to tolerate better than I did the mixture of politics and religion. But even they, no one really is left to support this regime except people who are benefiting from it financially or very, very visibly. In a way, the 43 years really showed and is showing what happens when you mix government and religion. You can't have either. You can't have religion because all kinds of things begin to interfere. There are people who actually, have avarice, are greedy, and they need to be set aright by some of these sheikhs, possibly not me, but whoever it is. It's a religious function, and there are other areas of activity that are political by nature, and they should be led by people who are responsible to those who have put them in position of authority and can take that position from them. So, in a way, I have come to appreciate the American system a lot more, but this can be said by the Canadian system as well, where really there is responsibility, but that does not mean the government has no power to interfere in anything.
Given the omnipresence of censorship and repression on expression through generations, through regimes, of the Iranian past, are you still hopeful that we are capable of an Iranian culture that is devoid of censorship?
I have no delusions about the present system. This system cannot be corrected. This system is in fact, in monarchy, one can say, corruption was really rare, or at least not part of the makeup of the system. Now, corruption is part of the makeup of the system. So, I have no good opinion of this present regime. But I've also sobered up to the fact that just because you make a revolution, we do not necessarily appear to the Arcadia or to the ideal state. No.
Right.
It takes constant observation, constant participation, constant give and take between the laity and the people in authority. So, if I have learned in the life that I have lost, it is that a revolution is not necessarily a guarantee of a better time. Things can get worse, and they did get worse in Iran.
It's an interesting answer to me asking if you have hope. I guess a guarded no, perhaps, is the sad answer.
Hope comes from within. I'm not optimistic. You're right, but I'm hopeful. Because you can't take my hope from me, and I can't take your hope from you. It's a personal thing.
Right.
It comes from within. But Am I optimistic? No. Should I have been more optimistic about the monarchical regime? Yes. I should have been more forgiving. I should have realized that there are segments of this society that would rule even not as good as he did, the Shah did. I didn't know that then. I think I know it now, and I think there's so much that I don't know even now, because it's a complicated thing. Everyone gets educated. Everyone gets hopeless at times, and then hope kind of uh, gushes from within and says you can't live without hope. So,
But this is a perfect segue to what I wanted to ask as a final question. Again,
sure.
I'm not sure if there's any right or wrong answer to this. This is more your nazar shuma, whatever your personal sense is
Mhm.
after all you've learned and studied and worked in over the years. There's an interesting juxtaposition. There's an interesting butting of heads in this conversation when we talk about Iranian writers and intellectuals between wisdom and naivete.
Yeah.
And I often think of the icons of Persian literature almost like our village elders, in ancient societies, the most vaunted, in fact, in every society except for the current West, the elders are always held to the highest esteem. And I feel like our icons of literature or poetry are our elders. And yet, how are we to make sense of the last 50 years of modern Iranian history with respect to the role of literature, the power and presence of those poets, juxtaposed, as I say, the butting of heads against the naivete or exhilaration of thinking change for the better had come only to have enabled something much worse?
Well, the first thing we need to do is there's no such thing as perfection. There's no such thing as God-like perfection. I don't know. I'm not sure if God has it either. But anyway, it's not. It's not the lot of human beings. The lot of human beings is to make things a little better if they can. And I don't worry about Iran. I think we should all stop worrying about Iran. Iran has been there for millennia. So it will forge the next system. Will the next system be ideal? Probably not. Can the next system be a little better than what we have today? Let's hope so. So you see, I think a gradual thing. Look at how many countries, how many lines on the map have changed over the past 500 years. And yet, Iran has remained the same. The same in some things, in, let's say, having a political presence, but not the same in tolerance. Shah Ismail, the founder of the Safavid dynasty 500 years ago, actually had people at the head of the markets asking people to start insulting the Khulafa, the heirs to the Prophet Muhammad, Abu Bakr, Omar, and Osman. And if they didn't, they would be beheaded right there because he wanted to turn Iran into Shiism. And Shiism, of course, is the kind of Islam that Sunnis think it's mixed with so much superstition and so on and so forth. But then superstition is a world phenomenon as well. Can we say in this country, in the United States, in Canada, and all that, aren't there people who think that they shouldn't vaccinate themselves for some reason? Yes, they are. Now, this may be a personal thing, but disease is not a personal thing because I can give it to you and you can give it to someone else. And so the point is, human life is imperfect. Can we make it a little more perfect than it was? Let's work for it. I'm not sure if we can, but it should be doable. Can we make it ideal? Can we see the ideal world? I don't think I can. So the point is, there are people who really become engaged in their countries, in their governments, or people who find other ways of serving. Let's say on the cultural plane, such as I have decided to do. Don't even understand politics as much as I thought I did, but at least I know that I'm somebody in making people aware of the culture. And in the case of Iran, it's the cultural field that really gives you the ability to become proud of your own country. There's nothing that makes you proud of Iranian politics either during the Shah or now, definitely not now, during the time of the Islamic Republic. But is there something that you find beautiful in that poetry? Yes, of course, much of it. There's so much wisdom, so much intellectual idea that's in there. You can go against it, but at least you have to be aware of it. So that's all I can say really to that point.
Dr. Ahmad Karimi-Hakkak, I thank you so much for this today. It's been so very interesting. I'm sure it'll inspire a lot of feedback and discussion, and I thank you so much.
How can I get some of those, the feedback and the discussion?
We'll share them with you. We'll happily share them with you. Yes, and you'll be able to read them on our platforms as well, but we'll send them to you for sure. Merci.
خیلی متشکرم. خدا حافظ شما.
Dr. Ahmad Karimi-Hakkak, a professor of Persian at the UCLA Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures and the founding director of the Center for Persian Studies at the University of Maryland. His latest book is entitled A Fire of Lilies, Perspectives on Literature and Politics in Modern Iran. Dr. Ahmad Karimi-Hakkak joined me from Los Angeles, California today. This is Full Time for the Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 21, brought to you with the support of Yazdani Law Group, one of Canada's largest immigration law firms, YLGPC on Instagram. Please check out our regular editions of Roqe and all things related at our fabulous website, roqemedia.com. That is roqemedia.com. Thanks to the amazing team who make Roqe Media happen. Talented Anahita, Super Patty Saw, Ponsa the Artist, Savvy Roham, Ahaya Mehdad, the fabulous Keon, Captain Reza, and Groovy Shaya. Thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe on this or any of our platforms if you have not done so already. Find me on Instagram at Jian Ghomeshi. Mizun Bashin.